Okay, today we're going to take a look at Bernstein versus Capablanca, Moscow, 1914. This is a game I often use to just simply teach people how to play against most d4 openings. This is actually a very good way to learn how to play the Queens Gambit Declined. I kind of use this as a sort of an ideal game. You know, what if everything kind of goes right? And I don't think Capablanca did a lot of heavy lifting in this game. This wasn't a very difficult game for him, and that was just one of the hallmarks of how Capablanca played chess. A lot of his games didn't look very difficult. He was an extremely accurate player who played very simple positions and just played them very well. So let's take a look. So the game starts off d4. So kind of part of my instruction of how to play against d4 is, or how to play the Queen's Gambit Declined if you're trying to learn it, is, okay, after d5 we have c4. So this begins kind of the Queen's Gambit. And one of the things that you got to keep in mind with the Queen's Gambit is that white will be able to take this queen at some point and put it on b3. And this actually makes it kind of awkward to develop your light squared bishop. And one of the ways that we handle this is we simply delay developing the light squared bishop. You know how in e-pawn openings you'll typically develop your king side first. You'll develop your knight, and you'll develop your bishop, and then you'll castle king side, and then you'll worry about developing your queen side. And that's just how we play king pawn openings. Well, queen pawn openings, we do it the same way. We actually, if we're playing black and we play the Queen's Gambit Declined, we develop our king side first. One of the difficulties I have in teaching, and I think one of the difficulties that people have, is they expect sort of like this kind of mental symmetry with chess, where if they open e4, they move their knight, they move their bishop, and they castle. And then somehow they try to do the same thing with d5, where they think their obligation is now to move this knight and this bishop, and somehow in our minds that seems like the same pattern. But it's not. It's actually very different. For one thing, when you play e4, the queen is supporting the push d4, and that dictates a lot of black's and a lot of white's strategy. Whereas when you play d5, there's nothing supporting the push to e5. So it's the difference between playing for what I call a primary pawn break and a secondary pawn break. A primary pawn break is when you break in the middle of the board with either e4 or e5 or d5 or whatever. It's any of these four center pawns, basically. A secondary pawn break is when you break in the middle of the board with one of your wing pawns. Now that could be a c pawn. In this case, that's a c pawn. That could be an f pawn. It could be, any of these pawns. Okay, so now that we've kind of covered that little tidbit about the opening, let's take a look and look at the theory of the Queen's Gambit Declined. So the Queen's Gambit Declined, we just start with the move e6, and this is just a really basic preparing to develop move. We're preparing to develop our knight to f6, our bishop to e7, and we're preparing to castle. And really, unless a capture takes place, you can just kind of play these moves in your sleep. You can just kind of do this. And that's what I love about this game. Capablanca just kind of plays the opening by numbers. He doesn't really deviate very much from just the plan of just getting his pieces out in the most efficient way that you're supposed to in a Queen's Gambit Declined. So his opponent develops knight c3. Capablanca just going with the plan. Capablanca had a reputation as a very lazy player, and he was. But he was also one of the best players in the world. He just always put the pieces where they were supposed to go. He didn't put a lot of thought into it. Knight f3, bishop e7, he just develops. Bishop g5, castles kingside. It's part of the plan. Knight f6, bishop e7, castles. e3. And then here's the moment where you have to decide, okay, how am I going to handle my queenside pieces? And Capablanca does it in the most logical and straightforward way pretty much ever, is he just prepares to develop them. Actually, first he develops his knight because he says, okay, I can develop this. I know where that's supposed to go. And then he's going to play b6, bishop b7, and then pawn to c5. And that's basically the plan for the queenside. And not only does that finish development of your queenside pieces, that gets in your secondary pawn break, which will allow you to develop your rooks once pawns get exchanged. So he's figured out a way to get everything out. So knight bd7, rook c1, and then just b6. And this is the plan. Bishop b7, c5. This is just all going to happen, and he'll get all of his pieces out, and that'll be that. So his opponent captures a pawn in the middle. Well, he has to, get his pawn back. He captures back. He takes d5. He's got to be careful in this case. He doesn't want to play knight captures d5, although that would be, usually that's kind of ideal if you can get your queen to e7. That's actually kind of a cool little thing, because it solves the problem of kind of where to put your queen down the road. But in this case, if you were to play knight takes d5, knight d5, and then e takes d5, bishop e7, queen e7, you're losing this pawn on the c7 square. That's kind of an issue. Okay, so e takes d5, and then queen a4, bishop b7. He just finishes his development, just brings his piece out. Now here, white makes a really questionable move. He plays the move bishop a6. And this seems like it makes sense because, this is a fianchettoed bishop and it's hitting this long diagonal, so maybe we want to trade it off, trade off the fianchettoed bishop. But this is a bad bishop. There's a pawn in the middle of the board on the same color square as the bishop, so that's the bad bishop. And this is, of course, white's good bishop because he's got pawns on dark squares and this bishop's on a light square. So why white would not just willingly trade them, but seek it is a little beyond me. So like I said, there was a lot of mistakes made on this game, but none of them on Capablanca's side. So bishop takes a6, queen a6, and then we have the final move in the plan, c5. So Capablanca just followed through with this plan. And here we are, we're developed. And we've done our secondary pawn break, we're ready to develop our rooks, and everything looks good. So now another inexplicable move from Bernstein. He takes this knight, and this is just a little tip on just development in general. You don't want to take a knight like this with your bishop, at the very least, unless you are prompted to do so. Because it's just a question of tempo, it's a question of time. You took this bishop, you brought it out, that takes a move. You move this bishop from here to f6, that takes a move. The knight that you were capturing took one move. Moving this bishop like that took two moves. That's why we wait to get prompted. What that means is I'm waiting for my bishop to get attacked with the move h6, because then at least we have an equal number of moves that have taken place for both sides. So it could be said that at that point, at least in terms of tempo, the exchange is equal. Now, whether or not you still want to trade the bishop for the knight, based on whether you think that bishop is worth more than the knight, or, depending on the pawn structure and the position, that's another consideration. But just in terms of tempo, you almost never want to just play bishop takes knight without getting some kind of prompt. Or, unless you're winning material outright. So if you're winning material, or if you get prompted with a move like h6, so that then the number of tempos are equal, then bishop takes f6 is acceptable. But under these circumstances, neither of those cases exist. So he just basically just took this knight just because he felt like taking the knight, I guess. Knight takes f6, and then pawn captures on c5, and then b captures c5, and now Capablanca has what we refer to as hanging pawns. Now, as scary as that sounds, it sounds like if you have hanging pawns, it sounds like they're bad. No, hanging pawns are not bad. And actually, its cousin, isolated queen pawn, that's not bad either. Hanging pawns are two of the sets of pawns that we use, hanging pawns and isolated queen pawns, that have what we call dynamic strengths and static weaknesses. Basically, the static weakness of hanging pawns and isolated pawns is that they have a hard time defending each other, and therefore sometimes they can be lost to attacks and things like that. So they can be weaknesses because they can be attacked and they can be won. But they're also strengths because they're in the middle of the board, and these are dynamic strengths. They're in the middle of the board. They're covering central squares. They're covering all these central squares in front of them. They're covering the middle of the board. They're helping your pieces gain scope and gain territory. And I would say that hanging pawns, as opposed to the isolated queen pawn, I would say hanging pawns are actually a little bit better than the isolated queen pawn, because obviously you have more control of the middle with hanging pawns than you do with an isolated queen pawn. But for the most part, any position with hanging pawns or any position with an isolated queen pawn, we just kind of consider these positions kind of The advantages versus the disadvantages of them, just they level out. So it's really just whoever has other things going on in the position that makes their position good that will win this game. So he's got hanging pawns, and white decides to get out of the middle. He castles. And then we have this move from Capablanca, queen b6. And what this does is it's putting pressure on the pawn on b2. And it's also offering the exchange of queens, which would make Capablanca's hanging pawns kind of not hanging. So if queen takes b6, you would have a takes b6, which would strengthen the center. And it would actually strengthen this pawn. This pawn on a7 only controls one square, and once it goes to b6, it then controls two. And it would develop this rook on a8, because my definition of development is a piece that has the ability to go from one side of the board to the other. So to develop rooks, you need to get them on an open file. And so after queen takes b6, a takes b6, that rook can make it from one side of the board to the other, therefore it is developed. Rooks are weird that way. They're like pretty much the only piece that can develop without actually moving. And rooks develop that way all the time. So the queen retreats, the queen goes back to e2, and then Capablanca plays a move that a lot of people just thought were bad. And Capablanca did this a lot of times in his career. He played moves that everybody else thought were bad, but now we just kind of look at him and go, oh yeah, that's really good. And just Capablanca's sense of position was really solid. So he played the move c4. And if you have a very rigid view of weak squares and weak pawns, you would just look at this move and go, oh, yuck, that's disgusting. Look at that d4 square. That knight can plop itself on d4 and it can never be removed ever again. You've created a permanent weakness on d4. Yes, I have. But I've also advanced my c-pawn, and you'll see why this is important later. I call this the world champion pawn, because just about every world championship has featured a passed c-pawn that has made it past the halfway mark that determined who was going to be the champion of the world. So this is actually really critical. This move, pawn to c4 in this position, just proved that Capablanca was going to be the world champion. It was obvious from this move on. You know, anybody that has mastered the art of the passed c-pawn is eventually going to be world champion, because this is featured in every world championship match. So it's a far advanced c-pawn that has the potential to become passed, and that's scary. And the reason it has the potential to become passed is because we're attacking this pawn on b2. And Capablanca wasn't the only person to discover this. Fischer copied this. Kasparov copied this idea. They would follow this up sometimes with a5, a4, making this pawn even more helpless on b2. So yeah, we've played c4 and we've made our pawn on d5 a target. But we've also made the pawn on b2 a serious weakness that we're going to be able to attack, exploit, and take advantage of. Capablanca understood this. He also understood that as much as the pawn on d5 was a target and it could be attacked with rook d1 with the knight on c3 joining in, that white couldn't do both things at once. He couldn't both occupy d4 and attack d5 at the same time. But at the same time, he understood that b2 was going to be very difficult for white to deal with. He was going to, at some point, have to either push this pawn or lose it. And Capablanca was right. He was very right. White's permanent weaknesses in this position, the lack of space, the inability to kind of defend his b-pawn in the long run, are more important than black's long-term weaknesses in this position. So he was absolutely right, and this is an all-star move, actually. So rook fd1 hitting the pawn, and then Capablanca just kind of calmly defends it. He plays rook fd8, just calmly defending that pawn. And then we have knight d4. That knight plops itself down on that weak square. Oh no, it's over. The knight's on the weak square. But that's all white's got. That was the long and short of his entire plan. He doesn't have a way to improve his position after this. So that's another reason you can start looking at this position. At this point, actually, black's position, as much as I talked about static weaknesses versus dynamic strengths, black's position is actually statically better here. Black can improve his position from here indefinitely, and that's how you can tell who's statically better. White cannot. White does not have the static advantage here because white's position has reached a maximum. He can't really put his pieces on better squares than they're already on, and that's a problem. So that's how you can tell statically who's better and who's not. That's a shortcut. Who can improve their position indefinitely versus who can't. And in this case, white's position has already reached a maximum. Clearly, white no longer has a static advantage. So that's what Capablanca does. He improves his position. He plays bishop to b4. He gets his bishop outside of the pawn chain. And all he's doing here is he's just kind of preparing to loosen up this position with the knight, where he can take the knight and then bring in his knight to a better square. And then he can continue to improve his position by either putting the rook on the open file, putting the rook behind the c pawn, pushing his a pawn down the board. Tons of ways to continue improving the position for black, and that's why black is better here. So white starts to feel the heat, and white plays b3. He was going to have to push this pawn at some point eventually anyway. He just decided to do it sooner rather than later. Of course, what this does is this allows the famed passed c pawn that has made world champions. Capablanca just plays rook ac8, and he sticks his rook right behind that c pawn that's about to be passed, and he makes it nearly impossible for white not to exchange pawns because he is also putting pressure on this knight on c3. So he is threatening pawn captures b3, and that's a problem. So b takes c4, pawn takes c4, and now all of Capablanca's pieces are developed, including these rooks, which can both now reach my definition of development. They can make it from one side of the board to the other. You have this rook protecting this passed pawn, which is on the other side of the board, and you have this rook, which is attacking a piece on the other side of the board. So all of black's pieces are defended. In fairness, all of white's pieces are developed as well. So rook to c2. He's trying to just kind of double up, but Capablanca is going to take that tempo gain there. He stepped his rook from c1 to c2. He's going to go ahead. Now he will take that knight. See, he was prompted. He waited till he was prompted. He waited for that rook to move. Then he took it. Then he made the rook move again. Rook c3 and then knight d5. And this is a really tricky move, and it's a really good move. He plays knight d5, just kicking this rook back. He's doing it so he can advance his pawn. And at first it looks like, hey, white can just take that pawn on c4, can he? Well, if white takes the pawn on c4, take a second, see if you can see black's next move here. Okay, black's next move would have been knight c3. Forking the queen and rook, winning material, because the knight is protected through this x-ray. So that's why the rook couldn't take it. So after knight d5, white replies rook c2, and then Capablanca pushes the pawn to c3, just gaining more space. So then pawn c3, rook on dc1. He's putting the rooks behind the pawn, trying to stop it. And now what Capablanca would like to do is Capablanca would like to be able to play knight b4 and just push this pawn down the board, just ram it down white's throat. You know, this world champion pawn, what I like to call it, the passed c pawn, the dreaded passed c pawn that wins every world championship match. He would like to play knight b4, and he would like to just ram it down the board and end the game. But Capablanca doesn't see a good way to do it right now. So he realizes that really the only plan is to try to figure out some way to double his rooks so that he can play knight b4. But he also realizes that there's not a great way to do that this second. So he comes up with this other plan where he threatens to double his rooks, but he does it in a way that makes it look like he just made a mistake and accidentally dropped his pawn. And this is kind of clever, and Capablanca won a lot of his games this way just because he was tactically very tricky like this. And so he plays rook c5, threatening to double the rooks. So that's the plan. He wants to play rook c8, knight b4. So white attacks the rook, and this is a big part of the problem why he can't do it. He just doesn't have time with all these annoying little moves that attack rooks. So he shuffles his rook back to c6, knight d4, and then he shuffles his rook back to c7. And actually, people that watched the game said he pretended like he made a mistake when he shuffled the rook back to c7. And of course, he could have, instead of playing rook c5 to begin with, he could have just played the rook directly to c7. He did this to make it look like he was flustered and he was making some sort of error, which he wasn't. You know, he was Capablanca. This guy was a robot. So he makes it look like knight b5 and knight captures c3 is possible, which it isn't. But his opponent was tricked, and he did it. He played knight b5, and this was part of the trick. Capablanca shuffles that rook immediately back to rook c5, and actually now it's too late to fix it. If he brings the knight back to d4, he can play rook c8, but he should have not taken the pawn. This was a very bad idea, but he did. He snapped up that pawn. He thought that Capablanca had blundered. He was sure of it. Capablanca takes, rook takes c3, rook takes c3, and now take a moment. Most people find the wrong move here. Take a moment and see if you can find the winning move. Okay, if you found it, the winning move was not queen b1, and I'll show you why. If queen b1, which is a huge mistake, yeah, and you can see right there that queen's going to go right back to f1. Queen b1, huge mistake. We would play queen f1, and then here's the big problem. If I keep going with a move like rook d1, there you go. You've got rook going back to c8, hitting the king, and that is going to be an issue because notice that our back rank is weak too. So after rook d1, rook c8, we would actually get checkmated here. Big problem. Okay, so the correct move after rook takes c3 is the move queen b2. And after the move queen b2, the game would basically be over. And the reason the game would be over is because after queen takes b2, and there's not much better than queen takes b2, we would have rook d1 mate. And then, of course, the alternative is rook c2, but after rook c2, we have queen b1, which would force queen f1, and then queen takes c2 is simply winning a whole rook and winning the game. So, okay. That was Bernstein versus Capablanca, Moscow 1914, and an object lesson on how to play a Queen's Gambit Declined. Thank you for watching.